14:32 p.m. A small regional airport. A sleek private jet sits on the tarmac, engines humming, ready for departure. But inside the cockpit, tension is rising. The captain's vision blurs from a sudden medical flare-up. The first officer is capable, but lacks the hours for this specific technical glitch in shifting crosswinds. Below, a 43-year-old ground crew member in a faded neon vest watches the radio chatter. The pilots had laughed at him all morning, calling him just the luggage guy. They didn't know that for 12 years, he owned the very sky they were now afraid of. Elias moved with a quiet, deliberate pace that most people mistook for slowness. At 43, he was a fixture of the regional airport's ground team, the man who knew every crack in the concrete and every hum of the tug engines. He lived his life in the shadows of the massive silver birds that roared overhead, content to be the one who ensured they were fueled, checked, and pushed back safely. He was a single father, a man whose world revolved around his 15-year-old daughter, Sarah. Every morning started the same way: a shared breakfast, a quick check of her homework, and a text message that arrived exactly 5 minutes after he clocked in. "Good luck on the tarmac today, Dad." 6 years ago, Elias didn't wear a neon reflective vest. He wore a crisp white shirt with 4 gold bars on the shoulders. He had been a senior commercial pilot, a veteran of the transcontinental routes with over 12,000 hours in his logbook. He was the man other pilots looked to when the weather turned foul. His reputation was built on a foundation of calm precision. He was known for feeling the aircraft's needs before the sensors even registered them, but when his wife passed away unexpectedly, the cockpit felt like a prison. Every night spent in a hotel in Seattle or London was a night his daughter spent crying for her mother. The silence of the cockpit at 30,000 feet, once his sanctuary, became an echo chamber of grief and guilt. Elias realized that you can always find another pilot, but Sarah couldn't find another father. He turned in his wings, walked away from a 6-figure salary, and took a job at the local airport. He traded the clouds for the concrete, because being present was more important than being powerful. His past was a secret he kept locked in a small metal locker in the staff room. Behind his lunchbox and a pair of worn work gloves sat his old flight badge. The gold was slightly tarnished, but the wings still caught the light. To the young, ambitious pilots who flew the regional routes, Elias was just a face in the crowd. They saw the grease on his hands and the neon vest, and they assumed he was a man who had never reached for more. They would walk past him, joking about the guys who just moved the bags, never realizing that the man they were mocking had forgotten more about aviation than they had ever learned. Elias never corrected them. He didn't need their respect. He had Sarah's. The daily routine was his therapy. He found a strange peace in the mechanical sounds of the airport. While the pilots focused on the destination, Elias focused on the integrity of the machine. He could hear a misaligned bearing in a luggage conveyor from 50 feet away. He treated every aircraft under his care as if he were the one taking it up. He would linger a few seconds longer on a tire check or a fuel line connection, his eyes tracing the rivets and seals with a practiced gaze that missed nothing. He was invisible to the elite, but he was the silent guardian of their safety. In the quiet moments before the terminal surged with passengers, Elias would stand near the runway's edge, eyes tracking the landing patterns. He noticed the subtle errors, the late flares, the jerky corrections, and he'd offer a silent critique. He was a man holding a library of knowledge in a world that only valued the latest headline. To Marcus and the other hotshots, he was a ghost in high-visibility yellow. They couldn't perceive the depth of the man because they were blinded by the shine of their own new wings. One morning, a group of new pilots stood near the gate, complaining about the sluggishness of the ground crew. They looked at Elias, who was carefully inspecting the tires of a Beechcraft King Air. One of the younger pilots, a man named Marcus, made a comment about how easy life must be when you don't have the responsibility of a cockpit. "Must be nice to just clock out and forget the world exists," Marcus sneered, adjusting his sunglasses. Elias just nodded and continued his check. He wasn't bitter. He knew that ego was a heavy weight to carry, and he was happy to be light. He had made his peace with the earth. But the universe has a strange way of calling men back to the places they once belonged. As the sun climbed higher, the calm of the morning began to evaporate, replaced by a growing sense of urgency that would soon pull Elias out of his quiet life and back into the seat he thought he had left forever. The crisis began at Gate 4. A high-stakes charter flight, carrying a group of international investors, was minutes away from its departure slot. The wind was beginning to gust, changing direction with a sudden, unpredictable violence. Inside the cockpit of the mid-sized jet, Captain Miller felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. His vision flickered, the primary flight display becoming a kaleidoscope of blurred lights. He tried to reach for his water, but his hand shook with a violent tremor. It was a severe drop in blood sugar, a hidden condition exacerbated by a morning of skipped meals and high-pressure briefings. He wasn't unconscious, but he was compromised. He knew the rules. He was unfit to fly. The first officer, Leo, was a talented pilot with 2,000 hours, but he was out of his depth. The aircraft, a Gulfstream G550, was throwing a secondary hydraulic pressure warning. In normal conditions, Leo could handle it, but with 20-knot crosswinds gusting at 30 and a captain who looked like he was about to faint, Leo's confidence was crumbling. According to the airline's strict safety protocols, a maintenance flight with an active technical warning under these weather conditions required a senior captain who was type-rated for that specific airframe. The operations manager, Elena, was on the verge of a breakdown. The investors were already seated, their expensive watches ticking toward a missed merger meeting that could cost billions. The air in the terminal felt thick with unspoken anxiety. Ground controllers were already juggling 3 other delayed arrivals, and the slot for the G550 was closing fast. Elena frantically scrolled through her digital manifests, hoping for a miracle. Every name she called was a no, or a not available. The tension was palpable. Even the ground tugs seemed to stall in sympathy with the paralyzed jet. "Is there any reserve pilot on site?" Elena shouted into her radio, her voice cracking. The response from dispatch was a wall of static and negative confirmations. The nearest qualified captain was an hour away, trapped in a 5-car pileup on the interstate. The flight was dead in the water. Elias was standing 10 feet away, finishing his final check of the landing gear. He heard the panic in Elena's voice over the open channel. He saw Leo's pale, wide-eyed face through the cockpit window. He knew that specific hydraulic warning. On this airframe, it often signaled a micro-leak in the actuator seal that heat could expand. He looked at his phone. A message from Sarah. "Coming home early today. Can't wait for dinner." Elias took a deep breath. He felt the phantom weight of 4 gold bars on his shoulders. He stepped toward Elena. "I can take the controls," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of her panic. Elena didn't even look at him at first. "Not now, Elias. We're in a crisis. Get the tug ready for a possible gate change." "I'm current rated on this aircraft," Elias repeated, his voice dropping into a tone of command that made Elena freeze. "My medical is cleared. My license is active. I have 12,000 hours, most of it in this seat. Check the database. Now." The young pilot, Marcus, who had been standing nearby, let out a short, bark-like laugh. "You? You're ground crew, man. You move the bags. Stay in your lane before you get someone hurt." But Elena saw something in Elias's eyes that silenced Marcus. It was the absolute, icy stillness of a man who had faced death in the clouds and won. She didn't argue. She ran back to the terminal office and hammered his name into the FAA registry. The screen loaded slowly, heartbeats echoing in the quiet room. When the data appeared, the room went cold. Elias Vance, Senior Captain, 12,000 hours, exemplary record, type-rated for the very jet sitting at Gate 4. He wasn't just a pilot, he was the man who had written half the safety manuals they used. The news hit the radio like a lightning bolt. The tower was informed. The airline's legal department was scrambled for an emergency verification. For 5 minutes, the airport stood still. The ground crew members who had spent months teasing Elias now stood back, watching him with a mixture of confusion and awe. Leo, the first officer, stared down from the cockpit as Elias walked toward the stairs. There was no music. There was no slow-motion walk. There was only a man in a neon vest who was about to remind everyone that experience doesn't disappear just because you change your clothes. The verification came through. Elias Vance is cleared for command. The silence that followed was the sound of 100 preconceived notions shattering at once. Elias didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the crowd. He simply nodded to Elena, took off his reflective vest, and folded it over the wing of the tug with the care of a priest handling a vestment. Beneath the vest, his work shirt was clean. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather case. Inside was his badge. He pinned it to his chest. The transition was complete. The ground crewman was gone. The captain had returned. Walking into the cockpit felt like stepping back into a dream Elias had tried to forget. The smell of the ozone, the hum of the avionics, the specific tension of the air. It all flooded back with overwhelming force. Leo, the first officer, sat frozen in his seat. He looked at Elias, then at the gold wings pinned to his work shirt, then back to the flickering hydraulic display. "Why?" Leo whispered. "Why were you out there, with the bags? A man like you? It doesn't make sense." Elias sat in the captain's seat, his hands moving with an instinct that 6 years of absence couldn't erase. He adjusted the seat, checked the rudder pedals, and began the flow of switches with a fluidity that was hypnotic. He didn't just look at the gauges. He spoke to them, his fingers dancing across the overhead panel in a sequence perfected by a decade of muscle memory. "Because flying wasn't the only thing that mattered, Leo," he said. "And right now, the only thing that matters is this aircraft. Give me the pre-flight status." The immediate problem was the hydraulic warning. The operations manager was screaming through the headset for them to take off. The delay was already 25 minutes. Leo was anxious, suggesting they could reset the system in the air or that the redundant systems would cover it. "The investors are losing it, Captain. We have to go. We can deal with the light once we're stabilized at cruise." This was the moment of choice. A man looking to prove his status or reclaim his ego would have pushed the engines and roared into the sky to show everyone his skill. But Elias wasn't there to prove he was a pilot. He was there because he was a professional. He knew that the crosswinds were the real danger. If the hydraulic pressure failed during gear retraction, the asymmetrical drag could flip the jet before Leo even knew what was happening. He looked out at the windsocks, seeing them snap violently to the west. "No," Elias said firmly, cutting through Leo's nervous chatter. "We don't take a glitch into a crosswind. We hold. Call maintenance. I want a physical check on the secondary lines, now." "But the tower is giving us a window," Leo protested. "They'll bump us to the end of the line." "They'll lose millions if we miss this window," Elena's voice crackled in the headset. "They'll lose everything if this line snaps at 400 feet, Elias countered. His voice was steady, immovable. He was choosing safety over ego, a slow delay over a fast disaster. This was the true peak of his character. He had the power, and he chose to use it with restraint. He waited. He ignored the pressure from the terminal. He stood his ground as a captain should. In that cockpit, the hierarchy of the world outside mattered not at all. Only the laws of physics and the code of the air remained. The maintenance team arrived, and within 10 minutes, they found exactly what Elias suspected: a hairline fracture in a high-pressure seal. It would have held for the initial climb, then failed under the intense pressure of gear retraction. Elias had been right. The young pilots watching from the terminal windows saw the maintenance crews working furiously on the wing. They realized that the man they called just ground crew had just saved the flight, and perhaps their lives, before even leaving the ground. When the seal was replaced and the warning light finally extinguished, Elias called the tower. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that signaled absolute control. The takeoff was a masterpiece. He didn't fight the wind, he anticipated it, leading the nose into the gust just enough to maintain a perfect center line. The jet lifted off the runway with a grace that left the spectators breathless. In the air, the flight was perfect. No drama, no alarms. Just the steady, rhythmic pulse of a machine, guided by a master. During the cruise at 41,000 feet, Leo watched Elias's hands. They didn't shake. They didn't fidget. They rested on the controls with a gentle authority. Elias began to talk, not about his glory days, but about the importance of the people on the ground. He told Leo that a pilot is only as good as the man who checked his tires. He taught the boy that the hierarchy of an airport is a lie, that everyone, from the janitor to the captain, is part of a single chain. If the fueler misses a bubble, or the luggage guy misses a latch, we're just passengers in a falling rock, Leo. Respect the chain. By the time they began their descent into the destination airport, Leo wasn't just a better pilot. He was a different man. They landed exactly as the sun was beginning to dip, the touchdown so soft the investors didn't even realize they were on the ground until the thrust reversers kicked in. The lead investor came forward to the cockpit, offering a handshake and a massive tip. Elias refused the money. He simply told the man, "Thank the ground crew when you get home. They're the ones who made sure this plane was ready." As Elias walked back through the cabin, he saw his reflection in a window. He saw the pilot, but he also saw the father. He realized that while he loved the sky, he no longer needed it to feel whole. He had done his duty. He had taken the controls when they were needed, not because he wanted the glory, but because he was the only one who could ensure everyone went home safely. The return flight was quiet. Elias was a passenger this time, flying back to his home base on a ferry flight. When he walked through the terminal of his home airport, the atmosphere had changed. The news had traveled through the aviation community like wildfire. As he passed the pilot's lounge, the doors opened. Marcus and the other young pilots were standing there. They didn't laugh. They didn't make jokes. They stood in a line and nodded. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment, his earlier arrogance replaced by a profound sense of shame. "Captain Vance," Marcus said, using the title for the first time. I'm sorry. We didn't know. We had no right to talk to you that way." Elias stopped. He looked at the young man, then at the others. He saw the potential in them, the raw talent that just needed a dose of reality to become true skill. He didn't offer a lecture or a display of anger. He just smiled, a tired but genuine expression. "Don't apologize to me, Marcus. Just remember to thank the guy who fuels your plane tomorrow. He might be the one who saves you the day after. Skill gets you in the air, but humility keeps you there. Every worker on this tarmac is your lifeline. Treat them like it." He went back to the locker room. The transition back was almost as surreal as the transition to the cockpit. He took off the flight jacket, feeling the cool air on his arms. He unpinned the gold wings and put them back into the leather case, sliding it behind his lunchbox and his spare work gloves. He put on the neon reflective vest. The weight of it felt comfortable. It felt like home. He had 1 hour left on his shift, and there was a plane that needed a pushback. He walked out onto the tarmac, the smell of jet fuel no longer a memory, but a current reality. That night, Elias walked through his front door. Sarah was in the kitchen, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the air. She was working on a plastic model of a 747, the same one they had been building for months. She looked up, her eyes scanning his face. She saw the exhaustion, but she also saw a spark, a clarity that hadn't been there for a long time. "You're late, Dad," she said, though there was no edge to her voice. She knew the rhythm of his job, but tonight was different. She saw the way he held his shoulders, a remnant of the command he had reclaimed. "I had to take a long way home," Elias replied. He sat down next to her and picked up a tiny piece of landing gear, a delicate part that required a steady hand. His hands, the same hands that had handled a multi-million-dollar jet hours ago, were now focused on a 5-cent piece of plastic. "Did you miss it?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes not leaving the model. "The sky?" Elias looked at his daughter. He thought about the feeling of the clouds beneath the wings and the silence of the high altitude. He thought about the investors and the gold wings. Then he looked at the warmth of the kitchen and the girl, who was the center of his universe. "I miss the view," he said, "but I don't miss missing you. I'd rather be on the ground with you than in the stars without you. A pilot's job is to land, Sarah. I've finally landed." He realized then that he had replanted himself. He wasn't a pilot who had been forced to become a ground crewman. He was a father who had chosen to be a hero in the most important way possible. The airline called him the next day. They offered him a position as a chief pilot, a job with a corner office, and a salary that would make his life easy. It was the ultimate validation. He had his wings back. But as he sat in his small living room, listening to Sarah laugh at a TV show, he realized he didn't need the validation of a corporation. He had already reached the highest altitude a man could achieve. Elias eventually took a deal with the airline, but not the one they expected. He refused the office. He refused the full-time flight schedule. Instead, he became a part-time flight instructor and a safety consultant. His one condition? He would still work 2 shifts a week as part of the ground crew. He wanted to stay on the tarmac. He wanted to be the bridge between the 2 worlds. He became the voice for the invisible workers, ensuring that the people who kept the planes safe were as respected as the people who flew them. He became a legend at the airport, but not because of his flight hours. He was the man who made sure the ground crew were paid fairly. He was the man who ensured that every mechanic was listened to when they reported a concern. He was the man who taught the pilots to respect the people in the neon vests. He stayed in the trenches because that's where the real work was done. He transformed the culture of the regional airport from one of arrogance to one of mutual reliance. He would often spend his breaks sitting with the new recruits, sharing stories not of his greatest flights, but of the times a ground crewman's sharp eye saved him. He turned the staff lounge into a classroom without walls, breaking down the barriers of rank and ego. He showed them that true authority comes from competence and care, not from the number of stripes on your sleeve. The final scene of this chapter took place on a cool autumn evening. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the runway. Elias was standing near the edge of the tarmac, his neon vest glowing in the twilight. A massive jet was preparing for takeoff. Inside the cockpit was Leo, now a captain himself, promoted ahead of schedule due to the wisdom he had gained from a single flight. Leo looked down and saw Elias. He didn't see just ground crew. He saw a mentor. He saw a master. Leo flashed the landing lights in a silent, respectful salute. Elias raised his hand in a simple wave. He stood there as the engines roared to life, the vibration shaking the ground beneath his feet. He watched as the plane accelerated, lifted its nose, and disappeared into the orange glow of the horizon. He didn't feel a pang of regret. He didn't feel like he was missing out. He turned around and walked toward the staff parking lot, his heart light. As he reached his car, he stopped to look at the sky one last time. It was vast, beautiful, and cold. Then he looked at his phone. A message from Sarah. "Pizza's here. Hurry up." He smiled. He got into his car and drove away from the lights of the runway. He was a man who had mastered the sky, only to find that the greatest journey was the one that led him back to the ground. He was no longer just a pilot, and he was never just ground crew. He was Elias Vance, a man who knew that the true measure of a person is not how high they can fly, but how firmly they can stand for the people they love. They thought he was just a man moving bags. They forgot that experience doesn't have an expiration date. He didn't take the controls to prove them wrong. He took them because he was the only one who could make sure everyone came home. And in the end, that's all that ever mattered. The legacy he left wasn't written in the clouds, but in the hearts of the people who walked the earth. End of script. Thank you for listening to this story about the unsung hero of the tarmac today. Sometimes the people we think are the most ordinary possess the greatest strength and experience. Never judge a book by its cover, and never look down on anyone just because of the uniform they wear. If you love these inspiring stories and the hidden depths of human life, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next journeys on High TL Stories. And what about you? Have you ever met an unsung hero in your life? Let us know in the comments below. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next stories.